They didn't lose this movie. They tried to erase it. That matters. A lot. Because when something vanishes by accident, nobody panics. When something vanishes on purpose, it's usually because someone understood it a little too well. This story starts in the 1970s when sci-fi was supposed to behave. Even strange sci-fi had boundaries. You could show the future, but it had to be tidy. You could show collapse, but it had to be abstract. You could hint at politics, but only if it stayed vague enough to deny. This film didn't do vague. It walked straight into the room, knocked over the furniture, and started pointing. The movie was On the Silver Globe, though calling it a 1988 film is already a lie we tell ourselves to make things easier. It was made in the 70s. It died in the 70s. And it came back later, carrying scars that never healed. And those scars are the point. Let's talk about what this movie actually is before we talk about why it scared people. On paper, the plot sounds familiar. Astronauts leave Earth. Something goes wrong. They end up stranded on another planet. No rescue, no return, just survival. They build shelter. They form families. A new society slowly grows. That setup has been done 1,000 times. What hasn't been done 1,000 times is what this film does next. It refuses comfort. The settlers don't become wiser. They don't become better. They don't learn from history. They recreate history at record speed. Fear turns into belief. Belief turns into structure. Structure turns into power. Power turns into violence. And nobody ever pauses long enough to ask why. There's no single villain. That's important. There's no evil mastermind pulling strings, just ordinary people making choices that feel reasonable in the moment. That's what makes it unbearable to watch sometimes. You recognize the logic. You recognize the excuses. You can see yourself in it. That's not entertainment. That's confrontation. The film treats religion like a survival reflex, not a joke, not an insult, just a thing people build when the ground keeps shifting under their feet. Myths don't arrive fully formed. They evolve. A story gets repeated. A detail changes. Someone gets elevated. Someone else gets blamed. And suddenly belief becomes law. None of this is framed as shocking inside the story. It's casual, normal, almost boring, which is exactly how it happens in real life. This is where the tone becomes dangerous. Because the film doesn't scream its message. It doesn't lecture. It observes. It lets events unfold without telling you how to feel. And observation is far more threatening than accusation. People in power can argue with criticism. They can dismiss it. Observation is harder. Observation says, this is what you do, every time. That's the kind of thing regimes don't like hanging around. From the very beginning of production, this film was uncomfortable. Not just politically, physically. The shoot was brutal, harsh locations, long takes. Actors pushed to exhaustion. Dialogue delivered like arguments instead of lines. Everything feels raw because it was raw. This wasn't designed to be smooth. The camera doesn't keep a polite distance. It gets close, too close. Faces fill the frame, sweat shines, eyes dart. You don't get the luxury of detachment. You're dragged into the mess with everyone else. That choice alone sets it apart from most sci-fi of the era. This isn't about wonder. It's about pressure, and pressure reveals character. As production went on, it became obvious this movie wasn't going to land safely. It didn't offer escape. It didn't flatter anyone. It didn't pretend systems collapse because of outside forces. It showed collapse as self-inflicted. By the time authorities stepped in, the movie wasn't a concept. It was a reality. Most of it was already shot, money spent, time invested, momentum built. And that's when the order came down. Stop. No debates, no revisions, no compromises. Stop filming, cut funding, destroy sets, dispose of materials. That last part is the most chilling. Destroy the materials, not archive them, not store them, destroy them. That tells you this wasn't about delay. It was about erasure. The director was removed from the system entirely, not officially banned with headlines and outrage, just quietly pushed out. Work permits gone, opportunities closed, a door shut that wouldn't open again for years. And just like that, the film vanished. No premiere, no release, no explanation. For a long time, people assumed it was gone for good. Film stock doesn't survive neglect. It rots, it fades, it curls. Once destroyed, it's over. There's no digital copy waiting somewhere. The idea that anything survived at all is almost absurd. But it did. Not because the system allowed it, because people didn't fully comply. Crew members hid reels, studios dragged their feet. Someone somewhere decided not to follow instructions all the way. Those small decisions are the only reason this film exists today. Years passed, political climates shifted, names changed, structures rebranded themselves. The world looked different on the surface, and then something rare happened. The director came back, not to a finished film, not to a project waiting patiently, to fragments, to gaps, to missing scenes that would never be recovered, actors who had aged, faces that no longer matched, continuity that no longer existed. This is the moment where most films die for real. You can't reshoot half a movie a decade later and pretend it's the same. You can't recreate performances that came from exhaustion and fear. You can't rebuild momentum that was violently interrupted. So the obvious move would have been to abandon it. That didn't happen. Instead, the film was completed in the only honest way possible, by admitting it was broken. Missing scenes are narrated, not reenacted, not faked, explained, plainly, almost bluntly. Modern city footage replaces what was lost: crowds, cars, concrete, the present intruding on a story from the past. At first it feels wrong, like a mistake, then it clicks. The interruption becomes part of the meaning. You're not just watching a story about a society collapsing under belief in power. You're watching a film that was interrupted by belief in power. The parallel is impossible to miss once you see it. That's when the movie becomes something else entirely, not just sci-fi, not just allegory, but evidence. When it finally premiered years later, the reaction was immediate and divided. Some viewers couldn't stand it. They called it confusing, messy, self-indulgent, incomplete. They weren't wrong about incomplete. They were wrong about everything else. This film doesn't ask for patience. It demands engagement. It doesn't guide you gently. It throws you into the current and expects you to swim. And that's why it still feels hostile to some people today. We're used to clean stories, polished arcs, clear heroes, clear lessons. This film offers none of that. It offers a process, a pattern, a cycle that repeats whether anyone learns or not. Watching it is exhausting in a way that feels intentional, because that's what living inside a collapsing belief system feels like. One of the most unsettling things about this film is how little changes between generations in the story. Children grow up inside myths they didn't create. They inherit rituals they don't question. Violence becomes tradition, and when someone tries to disrupt that, they're framed as dangerous. That dynamic is painfully familiar. The film doesn't pretend people are stupid. It shows them as afraid, and fear is far more powerful than ignorance. This is where the movie becomes uncomfortable in a modern way, because nothing in it feels outdated. We like to think censorship belongs to the past, that overt suppression is something old systems did, but the mechanics haven't changed. They've just gotten quieter, more polite, more bureaucratic. This film wasn't banned because of explicit content. It was banned because of clarity. Clarity is threatening. A movie that shows how power forms doesn't need to name names. People will recognize themselves anyway. That's what happened here. The authorities didn't need to argue with it. They understood it instantly, and they acted accordingly. The irony is that the attempt to erase it only amplified its meaning. If the film had been released normally in the 70s, it might have been controversial for a year and then forgotten. Another strange art film. Another difficult watch. Something for critics to argue about. Instead, it became a ghost. And ghosts linger. By the time it resurfaced, audiences were ready in ways they wouldn't have been before. The world had cracked open enough for its ideas to land. The delay didn't weaken it, it sharpened it. That's something control systems rarely anticipate. They think time dissolves ideas. Sometimes it distills them. What also sets this film apart is its refusal to explain itself emotionally. There's no score telling you when to feel sad, no montage signaling growth. The film trusts the audience to connect dots, and if you don't, it moves on without you. That confidence is rare. It doesn't beg for understanding. It assumes understanding is your responsibility. And maybe that's why it still feels challenging now. We're trained to expect guidance. This film gives you fragments and says, figure it out. There's a strange honesty in that. The physical world of the film matters too. Everything feels lived in. Nothing looks designed for comfort. Costumes are rough. Architecture is improvised. Tools look heavy. Bodies look tired. This isn't a fantasy of survival. It's survival as erosion. You watch people lose softness, lose curiosity, lose empathy. Not because they want to, but because the environment rewards hardness. That observation alone makes the film worth preserving. Because it doesn't romanticize collapse. It doesn't frame it as cleansing or necessary. It shows collapse as boring, repetitive, grinding. People don't fall apart in dramatic speeches. They just stop caring one small decision at a time. That's far more disturbing than spectacle. The film's reputation as difficult scares people off. That's unfortunate, because difficulty isn't the same as hostility. This film isn't trying to exclude you, it's trying to wake you up. And waking up is uncomfortable. Calling it lost has always bothered me. Lost suggests it slipped through cracks. This didn't slip, it was shoved. A more honest description would be interrupted, or suppressed, or unfinished on purpose. But maybe lost makes it easier to digest, less confrontational, less accusatory. Even now, the people hesitate to talk about why it vanished. They focus on aesthetics, on technique, on experimental structure. Those are safer topics. Talking about why it scared people means talking about power, and power always pushes back. The film doesn't offer solutions. It doesn't end with hope. It doesn't tell you what to do differently. That frustrates some viewers. But that frustration is also honest. Real life doesn't hand you answers neatly packaged. It shows you patterns and leaves you to decide whether you want to repeat them. This movie shows you a pattern, over and over, slowly, relentlessly, and then it stops. Not because the story resolved, but because it was stopped. That unresolved feeling lingers long after the credits. And maybe that's the final insult to censorship. They tried to silence a film. Instead, they turned it into a question that never shuts up. That's why this movie still matters. Not because it's perfect, not because it's easy, but because it survived interference and still tells the truth. It doesn't whisper, it doesn't comfort, it doesn't apologize. It stands there, damaged and unapologetic, and says, "This is what happens, every time." There's another layer to this film that people rarely talk about, and it might be the most uncomfortable one. This movie doesn't just criticize power, it questions the audience. Most sci-fi flatters the viewer. It puts you on the outside. You watch societies fail from a safe distance. You shake your head. You think, wow, glad that's not us. This film doesn't let you do that. It drags you inside the crowd. It puts you shoulder to shoulder with people who are scared, confused, and desperate for meaning. And once you're there, it doesn't give you an exit. There's no neutral position. You're either part of the belief system or you're crushed by it. That's a brutal choice to force on an audience, especially one living under real political pressure. The film doesn't say, look how bad leaders are. It says, look how eagerly people build leaders. That shift matters. Blaming leaders is easy. Blaming human behavior is much harder. And this is where the film quietly becomes a threat. Because if the problem isn't a single tyrant, then removing a tyrant doesn't solve anything. If the problem is how people respond to fear, then the cycle never really ends. It just changes faces, changes slogans, changes uniforms. That idea is poison to any system that survives on heroic narratives. The settlers in the film don't wait for oppression to arrive. They construct it, piece by piece, with good intentions, with reasonable arguments, with language that sounds responsible and protective. That's what makes it horrifying. Nothing feels extreme at first. Everything feels practical. We need order. We need rules. We need someone to decide. Those sentences destroy civilizations more efficiently than violence ever could. The film understands that. It doesn't dramatize the moment things go wrong. It stretches it out, lets it feel logical. Because when collapse feels logical, people don't resist it. That's a lesson censors absolutely noticed. Another reason this movie scared people is because it refuses to assign guilt cleanly. There's no moment where you can say, that's the mistake. It's death by 1,000 small choices. Each one justified, each one defended, each one framed as temporary. Temporary measures have a way of becoming permanent, again, not comfortable. The visual style reinforces this idea. There's no visual hierarchy telling you who matters more. Leaders don't look grand, followers don't look weak. Everyone looks equally worn down, equally human. That equality removes moral distance. You're not watching villains and victims. You're watching people, and people are hard to condemn without condemning yourself a little too. That's why the film feels confrontational even when nothing happens. Scenes linger, conversations ramble, emotions spill out messy and unresolved. It feels like watching something private that you weren't supposed to see, which, in a way, you weren't. The fact that the film itself was interrupted mirrors the story's obsession with broken continuity. Traditions form from fragments. Beliefs are patched together from half-remembered events. Authority rests on stories that were never fully witnessed. The audience experiences that same fragmentation. You're missing scenes, missing context, missing connective tissue. You're forced to trust narration, memory, and implication. That's not an accident. It's thematic consistency taken to a dangerous level. Most directors would consider that a flaw. Żuławski turned it into a weapon. By the time the film resurfaced, it was no longer just about what was filmed. It was about what couldn't be filmed, what was destroyed, what was taken away. The absence becomes louder than presence. That's a risky move. Absence makes people uncomfortable. They want clarity, completion, closure. This film offers none. And that refusal is political, whether the director wanted it to be or not. One of the most telling things about the reaction to this movie is how often people try to explain it away. They call it experimental, abstract, difficult. Those words create distance. They turn confrontation into aesthetics. But strip away the style, and the message is brutally simple. People create systems to feel safe. Those systems harden. Then they break people. Repeat. That's not abstract. That's history. The censorship wasn't just about ideology. It was about exposure. This film shows mechanisms that are easier to deny when they stay invisible. Once shown, they can't be unseen. That's the danger. Even today, decades later, the film still feels like it's daring someone to shut it down again. Like it knows it's survived once and isn't afraid of the consequences anymore. That defiance comes through in every rough edge. You can feel it in the pacing. The film doesn't rush to please you. It's not interested in momentum. It's interested in pressure. Scenes stretch until they become uncomfortable. Silence lingers until it feels accusatory. Modern audiences are trained to expect relief. This film denies it. And denial creates space for reflection. That's why watching it feels exhausting in a specific way. Not boring exhaustion, emotional exhaustion. The kind that comes from being asked to sit with ideas you'd rather avoid. The kind that leaves you quiet afterward. Another thing worth mentioning is how the film treats violence. It doesn't glamorize it. It doesn't frame it as spectacle. Violence is abrupt, ugly, often anticlimactic. There's no thrill, no payoff. That choice removes the illusion that violence solves anything. It just moves the problem forward in time. Again, not comforting. This refusal to offer release is part of why the film doesn't age. Trends change, styles date. But discomfort rooted in truth doesn't fade. If anything, it sharpens as patterns repeat. The film also doesn't care if you like its characters. It doesn't build them for attachment. They're not vehicles for empathy. They're examples, sometimes unpleasant ones. That distance is intentional. Attachment can soften critique. This film wants clarity, not affection. The more you sit with it, the clearer it becomes that the movie wasn't just ahead of its time. It was outside of time. It doesn't belong to a specific decade. It belongs to any moment where people feel uncertain and start looking for certainty at any cost. That's why its disappearance feels symbolic. Art that explains how control works is always at risk of being controlled. The attempt to erase it failed, but it left marks. And those marks tell a story as important as the film itself. We talk a lot about lost films like they're curiosities, accidents, victims of neglect. This one was a target. That distinction matters. It reminds us that not everything that disappears does so quietly. Some things are pushed, and sometimes they push back. The survival of this film isn't inspiring in a cheerful way. It doesn't make you feel hopeful about humanity, but it does make you respect persistence. It makes you aware of how fragile cultural memory really is, how easily it can be shaped, interrupted, or erased, and how much of it depends on individuals refusing to comply completely. That's not a romantic idea, it's a practical one. Someone didn't burn a reel, someone didn't throw something away, someone waited. That waiting changed history. If you're looking for entertainment, this film will frustrate you. If you're looking for answers, it will disappoint you. If you're looking for reassurance, it will actively push you away. But if you're willing to sit inside a question that doesn't resolve, it gives you something rare. It gives you awareness. Awareness of patterns. Awareness of systems. Awareness of how easily people trade freedom for certainty. And awareness is dangerous. That's why this movie almost vanished. That's why it still unsettles people. And that's why it refuses to stay quiet even now. It doesn't ask to be rediscovered. It insists on it.